There is an assumption sitting inside the original underwriting of almost every P-backed company in your portfolio. It passed every diligence test. It survived the IC. It was written into the value creation plan. It has not been formally re examined since the deal closed. And the cost of that, the specific economic cost, does not arrive until the exit process begins. By then, it's too late to correct it before the buyer finds it first. Today, I want to use labor as the case study. Not because labor is unique, because labor demonstrates a pattern that appears in almost every assumption category inside a PE backed portfolio company. And the pattern is what emerges. The assumption embedded in most PE underwriting from 2019 through 2022 was straightforward. Labor as a percentage of revenue would compress over the hold period through discipline, through productivity improvement, through scale. The cost structure would move toward target margin. The compression was a meaningful contributor to the EBITDA bridge. The assumption was reasonable. The models were not careless. They reflected available data and the professional judgment of experienced underwriters. And for years, the assumption held, not because the operating environment was stable, but because the financial environment was forgiving. When leverage was cheap and multiples expanded, a labor assumption that drifted could be absorbed. The financial engineering compensated for what the operators failed to deliver. That subsidy is gone. The margin now has to be manufactured. And manufacturing margin requires the assumptions underneath the EBITDA bridge to still be valid. For many labor intensive portfolio companies, they aren't. Three structural shifts age the labor assumption, not dramatically, but persistently, and in ways that distributed across cost categories rather than surfacing as a single visible failure. First, total compensation. Costs have been rising faster than models assumed, and they compound differently than a static ratio captures. A model that treated benefits as a fixed percentage of base wages is now carrying a structurally different cost than the original assumption produced. Second, in labor intensive sectors, healthcare services, field services, certain manufacturing and logistics categories, market wage compression moved faster than productivity improvement could offset. The arithmetic that worked in the original model closes differently today. Third, the labor pool supporting many staffing assumptions is structurally smaller than it was. This does not appear as one variance line, it distributes across recruiting costs, open position drag, training burden, and productivity gaps, none of which individually triggers re examination of the original assumption. That distribution is precisely what makes assumption decay difficult to govern under a monitoring framework designed to flag individual variances, not structural drift. Here's the sequence. And the sequence matters because the cost arrives later than most boards expect. The assumption decays, the variance appears in the monthly package, the variance gets managed, the budget gets updated, the assumptions never get re examined. That cycle runs quarter after quarter until the exit process begins. A buyer walking into diligence will find the labor assumption. They will build their own model using current data, current cost trajectories, current productivity benchmarks for businesses at similar operating maturity in that sector. If that model produces a materially different EBITDA than the seller's bridge, the gap becomes the bid ask spread. Closing that gap requires one of three things: a price concession, a credible argument that buyer's model is wrong, or operational improvement significant enough to bridge the difference before the process closes. Most sellers in this position can't make the credible argument because the re underwriting that would produce it has not been done. The buyer is not being aggressive, the buyer is modeling current reality. The seller is defending the original assumptions. That is not a negotiation, that is an information asymmetry. And the side with the current information wins. Now extend this across a portfolio. The same structural forces aging the labor assumption at one company are present across every labor intensive asset at different rates with different EBITDA implications, but the same underlying cause. The variance at each company looks like a company specific performance problem. The pattern connecting them is a portfolio governance problem. And the investment committee that review individual asset performance are not necessarily seeing the portfolio level pattern that connects them. This is not a visibility problem. This is an important distinction. The CFO sees the labor cost variance every month. The operating partner flags it at the board update. The board acknowledges it. Nobody can see it. Nobody owns the re-underwriting that would formally determine whether the original assumption still deserves to be trusted. There is a structural gap, reason for that gap. The governance process was designed to monitor performance against the model, not to formally interrogate whether the model itself is still valid. The monthly package tracks results against plan. It is not built to ask whether the plan was built on an assumption that has since changed. So the CFO does their job. The operating partner does their job. The board does what boards do. And the assumption continues to age, producing a budget that looks like a performance document, but is actually a compounding governance gap. Tracking a problem and owning a problem are not the same accountability model. The CFO tracks the variance monthly. Nobody owns the re-underwriting that would tell whether the original assumption still deserves to be trusted. That gap between visibility and governance is where assumption decay compounds quietly across quarters until the exit process makes it visible to someone who did not approve the original model and has no obligation to defend it. The mechanism is not a new governance framework. It is a question, one that belongs in board meeting, not in an operating review. Has anyone re-underwritten this assumption since acquisition? Not managed a budget, not updated the annual plan, re-underwritten, meaning returned to the original premise, tested it against the current operating reality, and formally determined whether the margin improvement attributed to it in the original bridge is still achievable on the timeline the model assumed. For assets in year 3 or beyond, that question belongs on the agenda before the exit conversation begins. Not because the answer will always be alarming, because not knowing the answer is a governance gap that a buyer will eventually surface. And the exit process is the most expensive place to learn what re-underwriting would have revealed 2 years earlier. 3 implications for sponsors managing labor-intensive portfolios. First, the re-underwriting conversation is not a management conversation. It is a board conversation. The CFO cannot initiate it without sponsor support. The operating partner can flag it, but cannot own it unilaterally. The board has to ask for it formally. Second, the assets most exposed are not necessarily the ones showing the largest variances. They are the ones where the original labor assumption was most aggressive relative to the operating model's actual flexibility, and where the remaining hold period is too short to implement changes that would make a buyer's model coverage within the sellers. Third, the bid-ask spread this creates is not negotiated away. It is either eliminated through genuine operating improvement before the process, conceded in price during the process, or absorbed as a return shortfall after the process. Sponsors who have the re-underwriting conversation in year 3 have options. Sponsors who have in year 5 have fewer. This conversation was never really about labor. Labor was the evidence. The larger conversation is this: private equity has built sophisticated processes for monitoring performance against assumptions. It has not built equivalent processes for formally re examining whether those assumptions still deserve to be trusted. That asymmetry, rigorous performance monitoring, informal assumption governance is not unique to labor. It appears wherever assumptions were made at entry, and the governance architecture was designed to track results rather than interrogate premises. Managing to a budget is an operating discipline. Re-underwriting assumptions is a governance discipline. As hold periods extend and operating value creation carries more of the return burden, that distinction becomes increasingly consequential. Every portfolio company contains assumptions that have quietly aged since the deal closed. Labor was today's case study. Somewhere inside the next board package is a variance that belongs to a decaying assumption nobody has formally re examined. The uncomfortable part is not finding it. The uncomfortable part is that everyone in the room will assume everyone else already has. My name is Preston Leahy. I'd love to have a conversation about your payroll and HR strategy and maximizing the value creation that applies to EBITDA